Christmas morning has a way of softening people. It makes even hard truths feel negotiable. That was what my daughter was counting on. She handed me a neatly wrapped box with a smile, so practiced it should have come with stage lighting. Her husband stood beside her, hands folded, eyes down, playing the role of a humbled man on the edge of ruin. "Open it, Dad," she said. "We really thought about this one." Inside was not a watch, not a photo album, not even something sentimental. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It was paperwork, legal paperwork, a loan agreement for just over $500,000, already drafted, already approved, just waiting for my signature. Her husband's business debt, dressed up as a Christmas miracle. The kind of debt that follows you into retirement and waits patiently for your health to fail before finishing the job. She called it a family solution. I smiled. I signed nothing. And then I gave him my gift. But before I tell you what was in that box and why my daughter screamed so loudly the neighbors nearly called the police, let me take you back a few days. Because betrayal never arrives suddenly. It rehearses first. The voice drifted down the hallway late one night, slipping through the crack in my daughter's bedroom door. I was halfway up the stairs with a basket of folded laundry when I heard her laugh. Not a warm laugh, a victorious one. "No, seriously, Claire," my daughter said. "It's perfect. He won't say no." She paused, then lowered her voice, conspiratorial. "We'll present it as a gift, an opportunity for him to help his family. You know how Dad is. Responsibility, legacy, all that outdated nonsense." I set the laundry basket down slowly. Her husband's voice followed. Calm, calculated. With his credit and home equity, the bank won't hesitate. He signs, the liability shifts. We get breathing room. They laugh together. A shared secret. "He'll feel noble," my daughter said. "Like he's saving me again. Honestly, he owes us. For years we've been temporarily living here. That's worth something." The hallway felt unfamiliar. Like I'd wandered into a stranger's house wearing my own face. I am 70 years old. I spent 4 decades as a senior compliance auditor for regional banks across the Midwest. I made my career finding exactly this kind of manipulation, people disguising greed as urgency, exploitation as love. And there I was, standing in my own home, listening to my only child plan to turn me into collateral. The next morning, I folded towels at the kitchen counter while she moved around me, cheerful, affectionate, unaware or pretending to be. "Dad, I didn't know you were up," she said. "Coffee." She used the expensive beans, the kind that cost more per pound than I once spent on groceries for a week. For someone who claimed they were drowning financially, she had remarkable taste. "We were thinking," she said casually, handing me the mug, "that this Christmas should be special. Something meaningful." Meaningful. I looked at her and realized something unsettling. I wasn't her father in that moment. I was a resource. That night, while they slept upstairs, I sat alone in my study, the one room they never touched because it didn't photograph well. No marble counters, no designer lighting, just books, framed certifications, and a lifetime of discipline habits. I pulled out old photo albums. My daughter at 8, gap-toothed, smiling a week after her mother's funeral, trying to be brave for both of us. At 16, rolling her eyes while secretly enjoying my terrible jokes. At 22, hugging me so tightly at graduation that I could barely breathe. When had that girl learned to weaponize affection? Or worse, when had she learned that I would never defend myself against it? I opened my laptop and did what I'd done my entire career. I followed the money. The luxury sedan parked in my driveway that somehow stayed leased. The handbags that appeared monthly. Weekend trips disguised as networking. 5-star dinners thrown away in glossy takeout containers. All while they told me they were barely surviving. I created a spreadsheet. Then another. Patterns emerged quickly. Debt, yes, but not desperation. Spending that contradicted every story they'd told me. By midnight, the picture was clear. They weren't failing. They were performing. And the final act was scheduled for Christmas morning. That's when I decided something. If they wanted to give me their burden wrapped in ribbons and guilt, I would accept the exchange. But I would give them something far more valuable in return. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, memories did. They arrived uninvited, stacking themselves in my mind the way unpaid bills stack on a kitchen counterquiet at first, then impossible to ignore. I remember the hospital corridor nearly 3 decades ago. The doctor's voice low and careful, as if volume could soften catastrophe. I remember my daughter sitting in a plastic chair with a coloring book, swinging her legs, unaware that her world was about to fracture. "It's just you and me now," I told her afterward, kneeling so we were eye to eye. "But we'll be okay." And we were, for a long time. I learned to braid hair by watching shaky online tutorials late at night. I attended every school performance, every parent conference, every soccer game, even when my knees screamed from the cold bleachers. I worked extra hours, saved relentlessly, paid for college outright, because I refused to let debt touch her future. I taught her how to balance a checkbook. Somewhere along the way, she learned how to empty one instead. By morning, nostalgia gave way to clarity. I sat at my desk as dawn crept through the window and opened a clean spreadsheet. Not because I wanted to accuse, because I needed to understand. I started listing what I knew. The luxury SUV she drove leased, but meticulously maintained. The watches her husband rotated like moods. The designer shopping bags tucked discreetly into closets. The dinners I'd seen receipts for in the recycling bin amounts that made no sense for people barely scraping by. Then I listed what they claimed. Unemployment, failed ventures, bad luck, temporary hardship. Numbers don't lie. People do. By mid-morning, the pattern was screaming. Their debt was real, but so was their spending. And the two did not belong in the same story. That afternoon, my daughter came downstairs cheerful, phone in hand. "Dad," she said lightly, "Justin and I were thinking we should finally sit down and talk about the future. Maybe after Christmas." The future. She spoke as if it were a shared project. I nodded, said nothing, and watched her walk back upstairs, her heels clicking confidently on hardwood floor she hadn't paid for. When the house quieted again, I went to the guest room they'd temporarily occupied for nearly 4 years. It looked like a boutique hotel room curated for social media. Expensive clothes, custom coffee equipment, framed motivational quotes about hustle and abundance. Abundance funded by someone else's restraint. In my career, we had a saying, "Lifestyle always confesses before the ledger does." And this lifestyle was talking. I didn't rush. I never did. Rushing makes mistakes, and mistakes protect liars. I began assembling what I privately called the timeline, where a husband claimed his business failed, when the luxury purchases accelerated, when the credit card notices quietly appeared, when they stopped discussing moving out and started referring to my house as home. One evening, while he showered, his laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. The screen glowed, unattended. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Emails popped up in the preview, pain panic threaded through professional language. Mentions of extensions, of partners, of consequences. One message stood out. "You promised this would be handled. I'm not taking the fall for you." The word fall lingered. By the third night, I knew something else. This wasn't mismanagement. It was strategy. They weren't drowning, they were treading water carefully, waiting for someone else to pull them ashore and absorb the damage. That someone was me. I opened another folder on my computer. I labeled it simply Christmas. Inside, I began collecting facts the way I once prepared court exhibits, clean, unemotional, devastating in their clarity. Social posts with timestamps that contradicted claims of poverty. Business registrations that showed activity without income. Credit notices printed, crumpled, discarded. I'd ignored those signs before because I was a father. Now I was something else. At dinner that night, they performed beautifully. My daughter sighed over her phone. "Another rejection email," she murmured. Her husband pushed food around his plate. "We're trying so hard, Leonard. Sometimes it feels like the universe just keeps pushing back." I nodded sympathetically. I testified 17 times in court against people who spoke exactly like this. Victims of circumstance, heroes of effort, casualties of fate. After they went upstairs, I returned to my study and added another page to the timeline. Claimed unemployment, 8 months. Verified job applications, fewer than a handful. Documented discretionary spending, astronomical. The gap between truth and performance widened into something unmistakable. The next morning, my daughter texted me. Breakfast tomorrow? Want to talk about Christmas plans? Plans. I typed back, sounds good. Looking forward to it. And I was. Because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I was preparing. What they didn't understand, what they never bothered to ask was what kind of man they were dealing with. I wasn't just a widower who spoiled his only child. I wasn't just a retiree living off savings and sentiment. I was someone who'd spent 4 decades watching people mistake kindness for blindness. I knew how cons worked. I knew how narratives were built. And I knew that every con artist makes the same mistake. They believe the story they're telling is smarter than the person listening. That night, I began writing something new. Not a spreadsheet, a plan. If they wanted to present me with a document, I would read every line. If they wanted me to sign my future away, I would first show them what theirs actually looked like. And if they wanted to call it family, I would show them the cost of abusing that word. By the 4th day, I stopped pretending this was about feelings. Feelings had blinded me long enough. What I needed now was proof. Real proof. The kind that doesn't argue, doesn't cry, doesn't manipulate. The kind that sits quietly on paper and lets the truth destroy the lie all by itself. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and returned to my study. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of my daughter's alarm clock upstairs set for a job she no longer had. I opened a folder labeled Christmas. Then I opened another one. I titled this one Morrison Financial Overview. Old habits die hard. When you audit a person's finances, you don't start with what they tell you. You start with what they leave behind. The recycling bin was a goldmine. Luxury receipts torn in half. Credit notices printed by accident. Bank envelopes opened, emptied, discarded like junk mail. I laid everything out on my desk like evidence photos. My daughter's name sometimes married, sometimes not. That inconsistency alone told me more than she realized. Strategic omissions. Carefully curated identities, depending on which version benefited her most. Her husband's paperwork was sloppier. Business proposals that never materialized. Expense reports without income. Spreadsheets tracking essential lifestyle costs that included things like boutique gym memberships and artisanal coffee subscriptions. Essential. I almost laughed. The turning point came late that evening. He left his laptop open again, this time in the study doorway. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. The screensaver never activated. Emails were visible in preview, stacked like dominoes waiting to fall. One thread caught my eye. Subject line, timeline extension request. The language was strained, desperate. Not the tone of man merely struggling. This was someone negotiating consequences. You said you'd handle this internally, the sender wrote. I'm not risking exposure because you thought family would absorb it. Family. The word felt dirty in that moment. I took notes, not screenshots, not copies. Notes, because I already had enough. By now, the emotional shift had completed itself. I was no longer hurt. I was calm. That's the dangerous part people never recognize the moment anger burns off and leaves precision behind. I reviewed my timeline, their move-in date, their spending escalation, the disappearance of real income, the emergence of debt, and finally the Christmas deadline, the gift, the trap. At dinner, they tested the waters. We've been thinking, my daughter said, touching my hand gently, about how lucky we are to have you. Some people don't have family they can rely on. I looked at her hand on mine, the same hand that once clutched mine crossing busy streets, the same hand that now measured leverage. You raised me to believe family helps family, she continued. Yes, I had. I'd also raised her to believe in honesty. She skipped that part. That night, I pulled out the photo of her at 5 years old, dressed as a princess for Halloween. I'd stayed up until nearly morning sewing that costume because store-bought wasn't good enough. I studied the picture carefully, not for sentiment, for clarity. That child hadn't disappeared. She'd been replaced. And replacements don't deserve the same loyalty. I made a decision then. This would not end with an argument. It would end with documentation. I contacted two people the next morning. The first was a former colleague, now a forensic financial investigator. Brilliant, relentless, expensive, worth every penny. The second was an attorney recommended with one specific phrase: plays clean, knows where hurts. I requested consultations. Hypothetical, of course. Always hypothetical. By the time my daughter came downstairs that afternoon, cheerful and unaware, I was already 3 moves ahead. She smiled. "Dad, you've been quiet lately." "I've been thinking," I said. Her eyes brightened. That was the mistake. She thought thinking meant softening. In my world, thinking meant preparing exhibits. That evening, I opened a new document. Not financial, legal. I titled the response. And for the first time since I overheard that conversation on the stairs, I allowed myself one honest thought. They have no idea who they tried to play. The law office sat on a quiet street lined with bare winter trees, the kind of place that didn't advertise itself loudly because it didn't need to. Dark wood, neutral colors, no inspirational posters, just competence. The woman who stood when I entered was in her early 60s, sharp eyes behind thin frames, posture straight enough to make truth uncomfortable. "Mr. Hale," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Whitman. You mentioned a hypothetical situation." Hypotheticals were how professionals told the truth without committing to it yet. I sat across from her and laid everything out, not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. Timelines, behaviors, spending, the upcoming request to co-sign debt. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she closed her notebook slowly. "How old are you?" she asked. 70. She nodded. "Then you need to understand something very clearly. In this state, anyone over 60 is protected under elder financial exploitation statutes." I felt something click into place. If someone deliberately misrepresents their financial condition to pressure you into assuming debt, she continued, especially while living in your home, that crosses from moral failure into potential criminal exposure. Criminal, not dramatic, not vindictive, accurate. "This isn't just about protecting your assets," Eleanor said. "It's about protecting yourself. Once you sign, intent becomes irrelevant. You're liable. Fully." I leaned back. "And if someone had documentation," I asked carefully, "of misrepresentation and concealment?" Her mouth curved into a knowing half-smile. "Then they would be foolish not to use it." 2 days later, I met the investigator. Her name was Naomi Keller. Early 40s, casual clothes, eyes that missed nothing. She ordered black coffee and got straight to the point. "People who fake poverty always get sloppy," she said. "They hide money like amateurs." I slid a folder across the table. Names, dates, observations. She skimmed it once, then smiled. "Oh, this will be fun." 3 days. That's how long she asked for. While she worked, I play my role at home. Sympathetic, concerned, present. At dinner, my daughter sighed dramatically. "We're just running out of options." Her husband nodded. "The pressure's intense." I nodded back. Pressure reveals character. On the third night, my phone rang. "Sit down," Naomi said without preamble. I did. "There's more money than they claim," she said. "A lot more." She listed it calmly. Hidden liquid assets, undeclared business proceeds, an offshore account routed through a shell entity, a recent sale of a stake in a side venture never reported. The total eclipsed $600,000. My jaw tightened. "They could cover a substantial portion of their debt," she added. "They're choosing not to." I thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment, I just sat there, not angry, resolved. I opened a new folder. I named it Gift. Inside, I began assembling something precise. Not revenge. Consequences. Once the facts are clear, emotion becomes unnecessary. That was always my advantage. I spent years watching executives unravel because they mistook confidence for control. They talked too much, reacted too quickly, tried to negotiate with reality instead of accepting it. I wasn't going to make that mistake. With Naomi's findings laid out beside my own timeline, the story was no longer subjective. It was documented, sourced, cross-referenced. The kind of clarity that leaves no room for interpretation or tears. I worked late into the night, assembling the analysis the same way I once prepared reports for bank boards and regulators. Cold fonts, neutral language, no adjectives that could be dismissed as opinion. Just numbers, just dates, just choices. A chart comparing claimed hardship against actual discretionary spending. A ledger tracking hidden assets against declared insolvency. A timeline showing how every plea for help coincided with a luxury purchase. The gaps weren't cracks anymore. They were canyons. The legal documents came next. Eleanor had been efficient, almost surgical. A formal notice terminating tenancy, fully compliant, generous even. Revocations of any informal authority my daughter had assumed over my affairs. An amendment to my estate documents establishing a trust with conditions so clear they might as well have been engraved in stone. 5 years of documented financial responsibility, steady employment, debt reduction, full transparency, not punishment, requirements. On the final night before Christmas Eve, I sat alone in my study with everything laid out in neat stacks. It felt strange, preparing paperwork instead of wrapping paper. But then again, this wasn't a sentimental holiday anymore. It was an audit. I went out that afternoon and bought a gift box. Not cheap, elegant, deep red with gold trim. The kind of box that suggests generosity before it ever opens. Back home, I placed the documents inside carefully. Analysis at the bottom. Legal papers next. Then the summary, my executive overview, written in the same detached tone I used my entire career. On top, I placed 2 final items. A small plastic calculator, bright, childlike, and a thin paperback I found in a used bookstore earlier that day, Money Basics for Beginners. I tied the ribbon slowly, deliberately. Downstairs, I could hear my daughter laughing. Music played. Decorations went up. The performance continued uninterrupted. She had no idea. And that, I realized, was the most painful part. Not the betrayal. The assumption. She assumed I would never look closely, never push back, never choose myself. That assumption was about to cost her everything she thought she understood about me. I placed the box beneath the tree late that night, tucked discreetly behind larger, emptier presents. Then I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No anger, no triumph, just inevitability. They had planned their gift carefully. So had I. Christmas Eve arrived dressed in warmth and illusion. The dining table looked like something out of a magazine, spread candles placed just right, folded linen napkins, the good china I usually save for rare occasions. My daughter had outdone herself, humming softly as she moved around the kitchen, playing the role of a woman holding her family together. Her husband carved the roast I had paid for, smiling like a man grateful for stability he never earned. "This feels nice," he said, "like a real family dinner." I nodded, sipping my drink. It did feel real, just not in the way he meant. They exchanged glances across the table, small, rehearsed cues. I recognized them instantly. I'd seen the same choreography in boardrooms right before bad loans were pitched as golden opportunities. After dessert, my daughter reached for my hand. "Dad," she said, voice softening, "we wanted to talk to you about something important." There it was. Her husband slid a leather folder onto the table like a peace offering. "We've hit a wall," he said. "The timing, the economy, everything, it's been brutal." Brutal was an interesting word for someone wearing a watch worth more than my first car. "There's a way through," my daughter added quickly. "A family solution." I opened the folder slowly. The loan documents were pristine. Consolidation terms, payment schedules, interest rates carefully calculated to look manageable if you weren't the one carrying the risk. "And you want me to co-sign?" I said calmly. Her eyes shone with relief. "Just until we get back on our feet." Back on our feet. I closed the folder and set it aside. "I have something for you too," I said, standing. Confusion flickered across their faces as I retrieved the red box from beneath the tree and placed it on the table. My daughter smiled, already convinced she'd won. "Open it," I said. Her husband untied the ribbon. The calculator came out first. He frowned, then the book, his brow furrowed deeper. "What is this?" my daughter asked, laughter creeping in nervously. "Keep going." The papers followed. The room went quiet as they read the cover page. Comprehensive Financial Analysis, prepared by Samuel Hale. My daughter's smile vanished. Her husband's hands began to shake. "You audited us," she whispered. "I documented facts," I corrected. They turned pages faster now. Charts, tables, footnotes, hidden assets, contradictions, timelines. Her face drained of color. "This isn't fair," she said weakly. I leaned back. "Neither is trying to give your father $500,000 of your debt as a Christmas present." The silence stretched. Then her husband found the eviction notice. "You're throwing us out?" 90 days, I said. "More than the law requires." Tears streamed down my daughter's face reel this time. "You're destroying us," she sobbed. "No," I said quietly. "You try to destroy me. I just refuse to go with you." The clock chimed softly in the corner. Christmas music still played in the other room. Silent night. Nothing about this felt silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room held the silence the way a courtroom does just before a verdict is read thick, deliberate, unkind. The documents lay spread across the dining table in careful, merciless order. Not stacked, not cluttered. Each page visible, each signature unobscured. I had arranged them that way intentionally. Confusion breeds denial. Clarity leaves no room to hide. My daughter stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into a different truth if she looked long enough. Her pupils tracked the margins, the dates, the annotations in my attorney's handwriting. She wasn't reading anymore. She was counting, calculating, searching for exits. Her husband flipped pages with increasing panic, breath shallow, eyes darting like an animal realizing the fence was electrified. He moved 2 fast pages bending, corners creasing, small tells of a man accustomed to controlling rooms suddenly discovering gravity. "You went through our things," he finally said, voice rising, reaching for outrage the way a drowning man reaches for driftwood. "You invaded our privacy." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I didn't even look at him right away. "I live in my own house," I replied evenly, "and I documented what you left visible." My daughter stood abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. The sound startled her another tell. "You recorded us," she said. "That's illegal." "One-party consent," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "In a private residence I own. Perfectly legal." Her knees buckled slightly as she sat back down, hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. I watched the realization spread across her face, not fear yet, but something worse. Loss of control. Control had always been her currency. From childhood negotiations over bedtime to adolescent arguments about curfews, she had learned early that certainty could be manufactured. If you spoke confidently enough, if you insisted long enough, if you framed your wants as necessities, people would bend. I had bent. Teachers had bent. Friends had bent. I was no longer bending. That night passed without resolution. They retreated to the guest room, whispering in urgent, clipped tones. I could hear fragments through the Vince numbers, names, questions that had no answers yet. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, they tried a new approach. Remorse. It arrived in the kitchen just after sunrise, carried on the smell of burnt toast and rehearsed vulnerability. My daughter sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes red-rimmed. She had chosen clothes that made her look smaller, an old sweater from college, sleeves pulled over her hands. "I know we made mistakes," she said quietly, voice careful, almost childlike. "But we never meant to hurt you." I poured my coffee slowly. Let the silence stretch. "Mistakes don't require planning," I replied. "What you did required rehearsal. Her lower lip trembled. For a moment, I wondered if she might actually cry. Not performatively, not strategically. Really cry. Her husband didn't wait to find out. He crossed his arms, jaw tightening, switching tactics without consulting her. You're taking this too far. The IRS? The banks? You're destroying our lives. I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. You destroyed your own lives. I just stopped absorbing the damage. He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, already calculating whether escape was possible, whether distance could undo what had already begun. It couldn't. That afternoon, my attorney arrived. She was everything I am not in moments like this: calm, precise, surgically detached from emotion. She wore a neutral suit, carried a single leather folder, and greeted everyone with the same professional courtesy she might extend to strangers in a deposition room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She explained, carefully, what could be challenged, what could not, what defenses were plausible, what actions would escalate matters irreversibly. She outlined timelines with clinical patience. She explained reporting thresholds, audit triggers, civil versus criminal exposure. She clarified that my involvement was limited, that my disclosures were factual, documented, and already submitted. There is no off switch, she said gently. There is only response. By the end, my daughter looked 10 years older. Her husband stared at the floor, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He asked a few questions, careful now, deferential. The posture of a man who finally understands the rules of the game. He thought he was winning. When my attorney left, she shook my hand and nodded once. No sympathy, no congratulations, just acknowledgement. The phone call started the next day. Credit card companies, lenders, former partners, compliance departments with polite voices and sharp questions. Once the illusion cracked, everything rushed in. Accounts frozen, credit lines closed, transactions flagged. Their phones became liabilities, ringing reminders that the world does not forget just because you refuse to look at it. Her husband paced the house like a trapped animal, whispering into his phone late at night. He spoke in fragments, in half-truths, in promises he could no longer keep. He slept little. He ate less. My daughter cried quietly in her room. Not sobs, not drama. The thin, exhausted weeping of someone mourning a future that no longer exists. I didn't intervene. This was the education I'd failed to provide earlier. I thought often about where I had gone wrong, not in this moment, but years before. About the times I had smoothed over consequences because it was easier. About the checks I had written to make problems disappear. About the lectures I had replaced with silence. Love without boundaries is not mercy. It is abandonment disguised as kindness. On the third day after Christmas, they asked to negotiate. They approached together this time, seated across from me at the same table where the documents still lay. No longer defiant, no longer rehearsed, just tired. We'll leave early, her husband said. We'll go tonight. Just call off the investigations. I didn't laugh. I didn't sigh. There are no investigations I control, I replied. Only consequences you triggered. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Even he understood now how futile it would be. She looked at me, then not as a strategist or a manipulator, but as a daughter finally seeing her father clearly. And she didn't like what she saw. Not because I was cruel, not because I was vindictive, but because I was immovable. She saw a man who would no longer negotiate reality on her behalf. A man who loved her enough to stop lying to her. A man who understood that protection, when extended too far, becomes a kind of theft. They left that evening. No dramatic goodbye. No final confrontation. Just suitcases rolling across hardwood floors and a door closing softly behind them. The house felt larger afterward. Quieter. Honest. I gathered the documents, returned them to their folder, and placed it back in the safe where it belonged. Not as a weapon, as a record. Consequences don't negotiate. They arrive when invited, stay as long as necessary, and leave only when their lesson has been learned. Whether that lesson takes weeks or years is no longer my concern. The house changed after that. Not physically. Nothing moved, nothing broke, but the air itself felt thinner, like something essential had been burned off and never replaced. It was as though an invisible fire had swept through the rooms, consuming whatever made the place breathable, leaving behind an atmosphere that could sustain life but not comfort. You could exist in it, yes, but you could not relax. You could inhale, but each breath reminded you that something had gone missing. Sound behaved differently. It didn't echo the way it used to. Before, laughter lingered in the corners. Conversations left faint impressions on the walls. Footsteps carried the assurance of familiarity. Now, sound stopped short, as if the house itself refused to hold on to it. Words fell flat, immediately absorbed, denied the courtesy of resonance. Even the television murmured without conviction, noise without presence. Light, too, seemed altered. It slipped through the windows without warmth, illuminating rooms without animating them. Sunbeams that once dusted the furniture with gold now merely exposed surfaces, unforgiving, clinical. Shadows appeared sharper, less willing to soften. The house was no longer a place that welcomed daylight. It merely tolerated it. Conversations stopped pretending to be normal. No more casual questions about dinner. No shared commentary about the news murmuring from the television. No idle remarks about the weather or some distant relative or a memory that surfaced unprompted. Even necessary exchanges were stripped down to their barest form, logistics only. Words were chosen carefully, weighed for potential damage, as if anything unnecessary might detonate. Trash goes out tomorrow. I'll be late. The truck is coming at 9. That was the extent of it. No inflection, no softness. Language reduced to function. Emotion removed like a liability. Doors closed more often. Not slammed, never slammed. That would have required feeling, and feeling was dangerous now. Instead, doors were shut with deliberate precision, the careful finality of someone who wants no excuse to return. The click of a latch became a statement, a boundary, a declaration of separation. Footsteps grew careful, deliberate. Each step sounded like a calculation. Where once there had been a rhythm, unthinking, unguarded movement through shared space, there was now caution. Paths were chosen strategically. Timing mattered. They learned when I was in the kitchen, when I was likely to pass through the hall, when my study door was closed and meant to stay that way. They became experts in avoidance, skilled navigators of an emotional minefield. My daughter and her husband no longer acted like this was their home. They acted like tenants waiting out a sentence. They woke early and stayed late in their room. They avoided shared spaces unless required. When they did pass through the kitchen or living room, they moved with the cautious politeness of guests who know they've overstayed their welcome but have nowhere else to go yet. Their eyes stayed down. Their voices remained neutral. Gratitude, once freely offered, became stiff and formal, like a performance rehearsed too many times. Boxes began appearing in the hallway. At first, they were folded and stacked, leaning against the wall like quiet accusations. Cardboard rectangles with printed dimensions, mute but unmistakable. I noticed them the way one notices a crack in glass mall at first, easy to ignore, but impossible to unsee once acknowledged. Then, slowly, they began to fill. Clothing, shoes, accessories, items pulled from closets and drawers, from shelves and corners. Objects that once felt permanent chosen, displayed, argued over were suddenly reduced to cardboard and tape. Identity compressed into measurements printed on the side of a box. Small, medium, large, as if a life could be categorized that neatly. I watched it all from a distance, not because I didn't care, but because stepping in now would only blur the lesson. There is a point in every reckoning where comfort becomes interference, where reassurance, however well-intentioned, erodes clarity. I understood the impulse to soften things, to offer reassurance, to remind my daughter that I still loved her, that this wasn't abandonment, that there would always be some form of connection. But lessons interrupted halfway become misunderstandings. And misunderstandings breed resentment far more enduring than pain. So I stayed where I was. I kept my routines intact. I rose early. I worked in my study. I ate my meals quietly. I did not hover. I did not observe too closely. I did not ask questions whose answers I already knew. Still, I noticed everything. The way my daughter's laughter disappeared first. The way her shoulders curled inward, as though she were trying to take up less space. The way her husband grew silent, his politeness hardening into something brittle and exhausted. The way they spoke to each other in low tones behind closed doors, voices muffled but unmistakably strained. At night, when the house should have been at rest, it felt alert, awake, as if it were listening. I thought often about earlier versions of this place. The years when my daughter's footsteps were light and careless, when doors were left open, when arguments flared and dissolved with equal intensity, when she sprawled across the living room floor, surrounded by books and notebooks and half-formed plans for a future she assumed would be forgiving. I remembered the certainty with which she once moved through the world, the way she believed consequences were negotiable, that love could always be relied upon as a safety net, that mistakes, however serious, would be absorbed by someone else's patience. I wondered when that certainty had shifted into expectation. On the fourth morning after Christmas, my daughter knocked on my study door. She didn't enter, just stood there, framed by the doorway, hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting to be called into a principal's office. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically diminished, but stripped of the posture that once made her seem unshakable. Her confidence, once worn like armor, now lay discarded somewhere I could not see. "We're leaving today," she said, earlier than required. Her voice was steady, carefully so, each word placed with intent. I nodded once. "That's your choice." She absorbed that quietly. No argument. No attempt to reframe it as sacrifice or generosity. Just acknowledgement. "Justin found a truck," she added. I waited. Silence followed. It stretched, uncomfortable but honest. The kind of silence that demands participation, that invites confession or confrontation. She shifted her weight slightly, the movement subtle but telling. She wanted something. I could see it in her eyes, the same look she'd had as a child when she stood in my doorway late at night, hoping I'd solve a problem she didn't yet have words for. The same look she'd worn as a teenager when consequences loomed larger than she'd anticipated. A look that asked for intervention without quite daring to request it. But this time I stayed seated. "You really would have helped us," she said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization, spoken aloud as if testing its shape. "If we've been honest." "Yes," I said. "That's the part you should sit with." Her face tightened, a flash of anger cutting through the vulnerability. It was familiar, that expression, defensive, reflexive, searching for a way to redirect blame. This didn't have to destroy us. "No," I agreed. "But deception usually does." She swallowed hard. Her eyes shone, but she refused to let the tears fall. Pride and pain locked in quiet combat. "I don't think I'll ever forgive you for this." "I can live with that," I said gently. "Can you live with what you try to do to me?" She opened her mouth, closed it. There was no answer that wouldn't indict her. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't strategic. It was hollowed out, emptied by truth. She nodded once, a movement so small it barely registered. "I guess," she said quietly, "we'll go now." I stood then, not to stop her, not to comfort her, but to acknowledge the moment. "To mark it as real. Drive safely," I said. She hesitated, just long enough for me to see the question she didn't ask. Then she turned and walked away. Later, I listened as the truck was loaded. The scrape of boxes against concrete. The murmur of strained coordination. The final thud of a door closing. When the engine started, the sound carried farther than anything had in days. Then it faded, and the house, altered as it was, settled into its new quiet. Not healed, but honest. She turned away without another word. Not in a dramatic way. No sharp pivot or flare gesture. No slam door or final accusation thrown like a blade meant to draw blood. Just a quiet withdrawal, subtle enough that someone less attuned might have missed it entirely. A turning of the shoulders. A pause that lingered half a second too long. The kind of movement that carries intention without announcing it. Like a door closing in another part of the house, one you don't see shut, but feel nonetheless. Her shoulders stiffened first, then her spine, as if the decision traveled upward through her body before reaching her face. When it finally did, there was nothing there to read. No anger, no remorse, no appeal, just distance. Whatever she'd been preparing to say, whatever speech had been rehearsed, justified, softened, or sharpened, evaporated in that instant, replaced by silence and resolve. That was the moment I knew the day would not end gently. I stood where I was long after she had left the room, listening to the house settle around me. Old houses have a way of breathing, of adjusting to shifts in atmosphere. Floorboards creak, pipes whisper, walls contract and release. The sounds were familiar, but they felt altered, as if the house itself had registered the fracture and was responding in its own quiet way. The sound of packing began almost immediately. At first it was subtle, indistinct movement behind walls, footsteps where there shouldn't have been any, the faint creak of a drawer being opened and closed again. It might have been mistaken for normal morning activity, the everyday choreography of people moving through shared space. But there was something different in the rhythm, a purposefulness that didn't belong to routine. As the morning stretched on, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Furniture scraped against hardwood floors with a low, protesting groan. Tape tore free from its roll with sharp, decisive rips, each one sounding like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. Drawers slammed, then, moments later, reopened more carefully, as if someone had realized too late that anger wastes energy and precision was required if they were going to leave cleanly. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands, listening. Not eavesdropping, there was no need. The walls were thin, and the emotions thick enough to carry sound without effort. Every scrape, every thud, every hurried footstep felt amplified, as though the house were acting as an unwilling amplifier for the unraveling inside it. It struck me then how anger always overestimates its own strength, how it assumes it can burn without consequence, that it can consume without leaving residue. Anger promises catharsis, but delivers debris. It convinces people they are powerful in the moment, only to reveal later how much they have broken in the process. Damage is cumulative. That even rage has to live with what it breaks. Occasionally, sharp whispers slipped through the walls. Accusations, fear, blame being redistributed in real time, passed hand to hand like a debt no one wanted to hold for long. These were not arguments meant to be resolved. There was no negotiation in them, no reaching across the table for understanding or compromise. They were pressure valve conversations that existed solely to release something toxic before it turned inward. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had heard it before. I didn't intervene, not because I didn't hear them, but because I had already heard them for years. Years of late-night phone calls that began with urgency and ended with justification. Years of explanations that shifted responsibility outward, always towards circumstance, always towards someone else's failure. Years of apologies that asked for relief more than forgiveness. I had mistaken repetition for remorse. By mid-afternoon, the truck arrived. Its engine idled in the driveway, a low mechanical hum that felt intrusive in its patience. It didn't rush them, didn't honk, didn't demand speed. It simply waited, confident in its role as the instrument of departure. Machines have no moral conflict. They perform their function without commentary or concern for consequence. I stood at the front window and watched as they opened the back, the metal door groaning upward like a mouth yawning open to receive whatever was fed to it. The sound echoed briefly, then settled into the background, replaced by the heavier thud of boxes being lifted and dropped into place. Her husband moved first. He always did. Fast, aggressive, purposeful, as if speed itself could rewrite reality. He carried boxes two at a time, arms flexed, muscles tight, jaw clenched so hard I could see it even from behind the glass. He never once looked back at the house. Not at the door. Not at the windows. It was as if acknowledging the building might give it a voice, and he knew exactly what it would say. Guilt makes cowards of men who pride themselves on confidence. I had seen that expression before, too. The forward-leaning posture. The refusal to pause. The need to keep moving lest reflection catch up. He mistook momentum for innocence, effort for absolution. My daughter followed. Slowly. Mechanically. She lifted each item with care, as if each one carried a weight beyond its physical mass. Boxes, bags, framed photos, small appliances, each placed into the truck with deliberate precision. She paused often, staring at objects before surrendering them to the dark interior of the cargo space, like someone offering belongings to a sea they weren't sure would give them back. I wondered what she was thinking, if she was cataloging memories, if she was mourning the loss of something she still hadn't admitted was gone, if she was angry with me, or herself, or simply exhausted by the collapse of a narrative she had invested too much energy defending. At one point, she looked up. Our eyes met. Time compressed in that moment. The noise faded. The movement slowed. There was only recognition, uncomfortable, undeniable. I didn't wave. I didn't turn away either. I let her see exactly where I stood. Not looming. Not hiding. Just present. Unmoving. A fixed point in a moment she could no longer control. For years, I had been flexible, accommodating, willing to bend and absorb impact. That day I was still. She broke the gaze first. When the truck was full, she walked toward the house one last time. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, I thought she might knock, that she might ask for something small and symbolic. A final conversation, a softened word, permission to leave without carrying the full weight of what had happened. I imagined her asking for a hug, or a truce, or some carefully worded phrase that could later be reinterpreted as absolution. Instead, she just stood on the walkway, staring at the door, as if memorizing it. I opened it quietly. You wanted to play adult financial games, I said. I showed you how professionals play them. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction, just fact. Her face went blank. Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness. The kind that comes when the last defense fails and there's nothing left to deploy. Goodbye, Dad. Goodbye. She turned and left. The truck pulled away. Just like that. No dramatic soundtrack. No cinematic pause. No final look over the shoulder. Just tires on pavement, growing quieter until they disappeared completely, absorbed into the ordinary flow of the street. The house was silent afterward. Not the peaceful kind. The empty kind. The kind that follows something being removed rather than resolved. The kind that lingers in corners and hallways, reminding you that absence is not neutral, it has shape and weight and echo. I walked through the rooms they'd occupied, drawers left open, a lamp broken at the base, hastily abandoned rather than repaired, a sweater draped over the back of a chair, forgotten in the rush, as if part of her had simply failed to keep up. The faint scent of expensive perfumes still hung in the air, already fading, its sweetness turning sharp as it thinned. Evidence of lives interrupted. In the living room, their gift to me still sat on the table. The loan documents, neatly stacked, carefully prepared, wrapped in obligation and presented as love. I picked them up, carried them to my study, fed them into the shredder one page at a time. The sound was steady, final, paper reduced to strips, signatures erased, expectations dismantled. With each page, something tightened inside me, loosened its grip. Not relief exactly, more like alignment, as if my spine had finally straightened after years of leaning. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat alone by the window. The city stretched out below, indifferent and alive. Lights flickered in distant buildings. Cars moved through intersections without hesitation. Somewhere, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, someone was making the same mistakes I'd just finished confronting. Life continued without commentary or concern for my personal reckoning. I felt sad, lighter, and strangely calm. Some losses hurt less than living with a lie, and some exits, however brutal, are the only honest way forward. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. No slammed doors, no late-night phone calls, no performance of family, just space, the kind that forces you to sit with yourself. I found myself listening to the house not for noise, but for the absence of it. Mornings unfolded without tension. Evenings settled without dread. I realized how much energy I'd spent bracing for the next request, the next justification, the next emotional invoice disguised as need. A week after they left, my attorney called. The investigations were moving forward. Creditors had frozen assets. Questions were being asked in places my daughter and her husband could no longer charm their way through. The tone was professional, measured. No drama, just process. I listened. I thanked her. And when the call ended, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt closure. On New Year's Eve, I stood by the window again and watched fireworks bloom over the city. People cheered, celebrated fresh starts, pretended the calendar alone could fix what honesty hadn't. I thought about the little girl I'd raised, the scraped knees, the school projects, the nights I stayed up worrying about her future, the promises I'd kept, the lesson I'd finally enforced. Love without boundaries isn't kindness. It's permission. I had confused sacrifice with parenting for too long. And in doing so, I taught my daughter the wrong lesson that accountability could always be outsourced to someone who loved her more than she respected them. That ends with me. I'm still her father. I always will be. But I'm no longer her safety net. If she chooses to become honest, disciplined, responsible, there is a path back. I made sure of that. If she doesn't, then distance is not cruelty. It's consequence. The house is quieter now, cleaner, lighter, and for the first time in years, I sleep without feeling used. If there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. Never confuse love with obligation. Never let guilt sign your name on a document your logic rejects. And never underestimate the cost of ignoring patterns, especially when they wear familiar faces. I gave my daughter everything I had. What she does with the truth I gave her last. That part is finally up to her.